Listen. Don't listen for the familiar pop, pop, pop of gunfire. That's not what this is. Listen for a sound like a giant piece of canvas being ripped in half, a mechanical, inhuman shriek that sounds less like a weapon and more like industrial machinery gone haywire. It's a sound that drills directly into the primal part of the brain, the part that knows only terror. This sound was so effective, so psychologically devastating, that the United States Army had to produce special training films for its soldiers, not just how to fight the weapon that made it, but how to master the paralyzing fear the sound itself created. They were instructed to listen for the brief pause, the precious few seconds of silence, and attack then. What kind of weapon is so terrifying that the first battle against it is fought not on the field, but inside your own mind? This is the story of that weapon, a weapon born from industrial desperation and ruthless ingenuity. This is the story of the Maschinengewehr 42, the MG42. To understand why this terrifying machine was born, you first have to understand its predecessor, the MG34. The MG34 was a masterpiece, an elegant, beautifully crafted instrument of war. It was accurate, versatile, and considered by many to be the first true general-purpose machine gun in history. But it had a fatal flaw. It was the product of a watchmaker's philosophy in a world that demanded a blacksmith's output. Nearly every major component of the MG34 was milled from solid blocks of high-quality steel. This is a slow, painstaking process that wastes a tremendous amount of material and requires highly skilled machinists and sophisticated equipment. The MG34 wasn't just a gun, it was a work of industrial art. And as the Third Reich plunged the world into total war, art was a luxury it could not afford. The Wehrmacht needed guns not by the hundreds, but by the tens of thousands. They needed a weapon for the assembly line. The task of creating this new weapon was given not to the giants of the German arms industry, but to a small, lesser-known company specializing in stamped metal products, Metall- und Lackwarenfabrik Johannes Grossfuss AG. Their chief engineer, Werner Gruner, was given a revolutionary set of instructions. The High Command did not ask for a better machine gun than the MG34. They asked for one that was cheaper, simpler, and above all, faster to produce, without sacrificing the core combat effectiveness that made its predecessor so formidable. The challenge was no longer about crafting the perfect weapon. It was about designing the perfect product for mass production warfare. The answer wasn't to be found in the precise traditions of the gunsmith, but in the brutal, efficient logic of the factory floor. Part 2. Anatomy of Efficiency. The genius of the MG42 was not in elegance, but in its ruthless pragmatism. Engineer Werner Gruner and his team looked at the expensive, time-consuming MG34 and systematically deconstructed its manufacturing process. The first and most radical innovation was their wholesale embrace of stamped steel. Instead of milling a complex receiver from a 49-pound block of steel, they figured out how to form it from simple, pre-cut sheets of metal. These pieces were pressed into shape by massive industrial machines and then fused together with spot welds. It was the same logic Henry Ford had applied to the automobile, now applied to a weapon of war. This shift from milling to stamping was a production revolution. It slashed manufacturing time by more than half, drastically reduced the need for skilled labor, and cut the cost of a single machine gun from 327 Reichsmarks down to just 250.
But this new, lightweight, stamped receiver had to contain the violent forces of the gun's action. To do this, Gruner developed a second masterpiece of engineering, a simple yet incredibly robust roller locking system. At the heart of the beast, Inside the bolt were two small rollers. As the bolt slammed forward, these rollers would push outwards into recesses cut into the barrel extension, creating a rock-solid lockup at the moment of firing. Immediately after the shot, recoil forces would drive the barrel and bolt back a short distance, where cams would force the rollers back inward, unlocking the bolt and allowing it to cycle. It was a brilliantly simple and effective mechanism that could withstand the immense pressures of a high rate of fire while being composed of just a few rugged parts. This roller locking system was the engine that allowed the stamped steel frame to function reliably at an infernal pace. This pace, up to 1,500 rounds per minute in some versions, created an enormous amount of heat. An MG42 barrel could become red hot after firing just 200 to 250 rounds, which at its rate of fire could take as little as 10 seconds of continuous fire. At that temperature, accuracy degrades, barrels warp, and cartridges can even cook off, firing without the trigger being pulled. To solve this, the designers incorporated the MG42's third and arguably most critical feature, a phenomenally fast, quick-change barrel system. On the right side of the gun was a simple hinged flap. A gunner could flip this flap open and the entire hot barrel assembly would pivot out. He could then grab it by the chamber end, toss it aside, and slide a cool barrel into place. Closing the flap locked the new barrel in and readied the gun to fire. The entire process could be done in 5 to 7 seconds by a trained crewman. This feature wasn't a convenience. It was the key to the MG42's entire combat doctrine. It transformed the weapon from a mere machine gun into a tool capable of providing truly sustained, overwhelming suppressive fire. Part 3. Hitler's Buzzsaw in action. The MG42 wasn't just a new gun, it was the heart of an entire military philosophy. For the German Wehrmacht, the infantry squad did not merely possess a machine gun, the squad existed to serve the machine gun. The riflemen in a groupie were not primarily there to engage the enemy on their own. Their main function was to carry ammunition, spot targets, and provide a protective screen for the MG42 and its crew, who were tasked with delivering the vast majority of the squad's firepower. The gunner, or Ritsuche, was the most important man in the unit. His job was to lay down a devastating field of fire, pinning the enemy down, breaking up attacks, and creating opportunities for the riflemen to maneuver. This doctrine was built entirely around the MG42's ability to dominate a battlefield through sheer volume of fire. From the frozen hell of the Eastern Front to the dusty hills of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy, the MG42 carved a brutal reputation for itself. Its signature, terrifying sound became synonymous with German defensive positions. Allied soldiers learned to dread the Buzzsaw, a weapon that could saturate an entire area with a hail of 7.92mm bullets. A single, well-placed MG42 nest could halt the advance of a company-sized element, forcing soldiers to hug the earth, unable to move or effectively return fire.
Allied forces quickly realized they could not win a direct firefight against an entrenched MG42. Their own machine guns, like the American Browning M1919 and the British Bren, were excellent, reliable weapons, but with rates of fire around 500 to 600 rounds per minute, they were simply outclassed in a suppressive fire contest. Instead, Allied doctrine evolved to counter the MG42 through tactics and combined arms. The key was not to outshoot the Buzzsaw, but to outmaneuver it. Infantry would use their own machine guns and rifle fire to fix the MG42's position, forcing the gunner to keep his head down. Then, they would call in mortars or artillery to bombard the nest. Simultaneously, flanking teams would crawl or maneuver around the sides, outside the gun's main cone of fire. Everyone listened intently for that critical 5 to 7 second pause, the moment the German gunner was frantically changing his glowing hot barrel. That silence was the signal, the precious window of opportunity to rush the position before the ripping sound of death began anew. Part 4. Rebirth in a New Army. In May of 1945, the guns of the Second World War fell silent in Europe. The Third Reich had crumbled, its factories lay in ruins, and its armies were defeated. The MG42, a weapon inextricably linked to the Nazi war machine, should have died with it, destined to become a relic seen only in museums. But the design itself, the cold, brutal logic of its stamped steel construction and roller-locked action, was simply too effective to disappear. The war was over, but the story of the MG42 was not. A decade later, the world was locked in a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. Germany was divided, and in 1955, West Germany was permitted to rearm and form a new military, the Bundeswehr, to serve as a bulwark against the Soviet threat. This new army needed a new standard-issue general-purpose machine gun. German engineers, tasked with equipping their soldiers, looked at the options. They could have spent years and millions of Deutschmarks developing an entirely new weapon from scratch. Instead, they looked to their own recent past. They knew that the best design they had ever produced was lying dormant in the archives. In a move of supreme pragmatism, they decided to resurrect the MG42. The result was the MG3. It was not a new gun in a spiritual sense. It was a direct lineal descendant of the MG42, a near clone with only a few critical modifications. The most significant change was rechambering it from the old 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge to the new, standardized 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, ensuring ammunition compatibility with its new allies. To accomplish this, a new bolt and barrel were required. Engineers also added a heavier bolt, which had the effect of slightly reducing the ferocious rate of fire from a wild 1200 to 1500 RPM down to a more manageable but still devastating 1000 to 1200 RPM. This small change made the gun slightly more controllable and conserved ammunition, but it did nothing to alter its fundamental character. The terrifying sound, the lightning-fast barrel change, the stamped steel receiver, it was all pure MG42. The adoption of the MG3 by the new German army was just the beginning. The weapon's reputation for reliability, simplicity, and overwhelming firepower was undeniable. Soon, other nations began adopting it or building their own versions. The Yugoslavian M53 was a nearly identical clone, still chambered in the original 7.92 mm. NATO allies like Italy, Spain, Denmark, and Portugal adopted the MG3. It was licensed for production in Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey. The design that had once been the scourge of the Allies was now a cornerstone of their own defensive arsenal. The ultimate testament to its success was its adoption by over 30 countries worldwide, cementing its status as one of the most enduring and influential firearm designs in history.
Part 5. The Dark Reason for Immortality. So we arrive at the central question. In an age of smart bombs, advanced optics, and lightweight polymer firearms, why is a design conceived in the darkest days of the 1930s still in service all over the world? The answer is not nostalgia. It is not a lack of funding. The answer is a cold, pragmatic acknowledgement of a grim battlefield truth. The MG42 and its descendants, like the MG3, are still here for two dark, brutally simple reasons. The first reason is the core function of a general-purpose machine gun, suppression. The primary job of a weapon like this is not to place a single precise shot on a target. It is to dominate a piece of ground through a sheer, overwhelming volume of fire. It is to make the enemy unable to move, unable to think, unable to return fire. It is a tool of area denial. And in that role, the sheer density of fire produced by the MG3's 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire remains almost unparalleled. More modern and much more expensive machine guns, like the American M240 or the Belgian FN Mag, are superb, accurate weapons, but they fire at a more sedate 600 to 800 rounds per minute. The MG3 simply puts more lead into a given area in a shorter amount of time. And its terrifying, ripping canvas sound remains a potent psychological weapon to this day. A soldier pinned down by that sound is a soldier who is effectively out of the fight. The second reason is the genius of its original design philosophy. The MG42 was built from the start to be cheap, reliable, and easy to mass produce. That stamped steel construction, chosen out of wartime necessity, proved to be phenomenally durable and resistant to the mud, dust, and abuse of the battlefield. It has fewer complex, finely machined parts to break than many of its modern counterparts. It is a weapon that can be manufactured efficiently and maintained in the field by soldiers, not just expert armorers. Its core principles of reliability and manufacturability are just as valuable today as they were in 1942. The dark reason for the MG42's immortality is that it is the perfect, ruthless solution to a specific, brutal tactical problem. It is the quintessential example of the philosophy that form follows function, where the function is total battlefield dominance through a storm of steel. It is not an elegant weapon. It is not a precise weapon. It is a terrifyingly efficient machine for killing and suppression, stripped of all non-essential elements. And as long as infantry soldiers need a reliable tool to pin their enemies to the ground and control the fire-swept space between them, the descendants of Hitler's Buzzsaw will continue to do their grim, horrifying work.